My topic today is on opportunities and challenges for sea level rise response for Hawaii. And I'm glad I started with this slide because as Chip walked in, he reminded me of a conversation we had about 21 years ago. So I was a graduate student and I went into Chip's office. So I thought I wanted to do my dissertation on sea level rise, like the economics of sea level rise. So I went into his office and was kind of like, well, what's the state of the science? Like, are there maps I can look at? Like, what can I use to model this? And he gave me a really long, like, well, there's this, but the probability bands are like that, and then there's this, and then, yeah, we like the error term's really large. And so we're really working on doing this. And I remember being in that meeting being like, oh, I'll never finish my dissertation. And so I was like, never mind, I'm not going to do sea level rise for my dissertation. And instead I worked on energy policy for 20 years. But in the back of my mind was always to go back to this. And so with Chip's group and all of the modeling products coming out of SOAS, we've really been able to do that in the last, I'd say, 6 years, right? So it's with this really good sort of physical science that we at ISR have been able to launch on this and say, like, okay, now if we have, understanding better what's happening on the potential flooding, we have, uncertainty in timelines, of course, but at least we kind of know where water might head, right? And what kind of water, and that matters too. Anyway, so ISR launched into a sea level rise research agenda about 6 years ago, really asking, how are we going to respond to this, right? How are our social systems, how are our economic systems, whoops, sorry, I didn't know there was going to change. So probably a lot of you in this room already kind of know a lot about sea level rise science, but I'm going to back up a little bit and say, like, what does this look like in our communities, right? Because it's not just at the beach. That's an important thing to remember. So this is a really high tide in Mapunapuna at the Hupulea site in 2019. And this is something that happens in Mapunapuna more frequently, right? That, you might get 3 days of flooding one year, a really high king tide year, maybe it's like 6 days of flooding. And over time, it's going to be more and more sort of like nuisance flooding through the day until it becomes a new normal, right? This is something that Chip and I went on this trip in 2019, actually, around this time. We went to Miami on the highest king tide of the year in September 2019. And that was like mind-blowing, right? We saw cars like, trailing off the freeway in 2 feet of water. Every like chief resilience officer or city engineer that was touring us around had a story about, oh gosh, I parked my car, but I forgot to look at the tide app, and so it got washed away. And you're like, oh, okay, so that's in our future, right? So all of these things that you live with, right? You live with all of these new normals until it becomes unlivable. And so that's one of the queries, right? Is like, how long can you live with this, with different types of fixes versus like have to wholesale change your system? Sea level rise also looks like, coastal erosion and wave flooding. And this is the modeling that SOAS has done. And in response to coastal erosion, historically, this is what we've been doing, right? We start losing our beaches, we start having erosion because, well, erosion is a natural process anyways, right? And then you put the fingerprint of sea level rise on it and it happens faster. And then you have your road, right? And so we need to save the road as an access way. So we start throwing riprap on the beach, right? And ultimately, this is at the expense of the beach for the benefit of still being able to access this area, right? So how do we want to deal with that over time? This is a little bit more of they're all kind of ad hoc reactive things, right? But this is sort of even more ad hoc, right? This is we throw sandbags on the beach, probably not permitted, not legal, right? Households are sort of just taking this into their own actions in order to save their homes. This is a picture from 2022. Since then, another house has fallen in. This is like the Camis area of Sunset. And you can see just, there was a lot of like geotextile materials that have been put on the beach there in order to stabilize the sand. They were initially permitted for a very short period of time. All of the permits have since run out. Some of the geotextile material is still there. This house never did that and was then once one of the first houses to fall in, right? So with our current shoreline laws, we're going to see this much, much more frequently, right? Our shoreline laws prioritize preservation of sandy beaches, which means minimizing hard shorelines, which means eventually this is what happens under a sea level rise future. So what can we do? This is kind of like the highest level generic adaptation options 101, right? You can protect, so you can harden your shorelines. You can build enormous seawalls and other things to stabilize the land. And this is not protect the beach, right? The language is a little difficult. This is protect the land, right? Protect the house behind, protect the building behind. You can also do softer approaches like living shorelines, right? We often hear things like nature-based solutions. In the sea level rise world, that's just like another way to say protect the land, right? And maybe it looks a little greener, but it's still the same thing. Again, our laws don't really support this, right? At least not for private residential areas. We can accommodate. Again, our laws don't really support this, but it's happening, so it's important to cover. It's still possible. We can accommodate, and a lot of this is living with water. So maybe our laws do support this, I should say, when we're talking about groundwater inundation. A lot of that will be accommodate, right? It's okay, your yard got soupier, right? And so maybe you build walkways. Maybe you raise your house on stilts in order to have a higher flood elevation, right? So there are different ways that you can kind of live with water and manage the water while not trying to totally push it out, right? And then you can retreat. And this is, let's limit new development in hazardous areas. Let's remove development from hazardous areas, and let's conserve this open space. And again, what you do at the actual coastline on a sandy beach is probably very, very different than what you do inland where you have groundwater inundation, right? And then of course, the hybrid options are any combination thereof that gets you to some kind of adaptive pathway outcome. So the modeling that Chip has done is around coastal erosion. So this would be, how might coastal erosion be accelerated into the future? And so what can we say about the future shoreline? So this particular modeling product has been extremely useful to our research because it legally gives us an idea of what would be the shoreline in the future. And in Hawaii, because we have a rolling shoreline, we have perfect land transfer, theoretically, from private to public, right? And so this sets our future estimate of land transfer in practice, and this sets our future estimate of land transfer in like theoretical perfectness, right? Because it's supposed to be wherever the annual high wash of the waves go, that is what sets your shoreline. But in actuality, it's often the debris line or the erosion line, right? So there is this like gap in implementation about what the shoreline laws say and the way that we tend to treat the shoreline within our rulemaking. Then we have passive flooding, which is that picture from Makena Coffman, right? And that would be a different kind of sea level rise adaptation that we might get to. Okay, so just a quick like Hawaii Revised Statutes 205A primer. The shoreline is the upper reach of the wash of the waves, other than in a storm and seismic waves. Actually, I will say this part of the sentence is like still in legal contestation. It's never said like how you determine a storm or seismic waves, a little more obvious. What constitutes a storm? This is kind of an untested legal sentence. At high tide during the season of any year, basically, and it's evidenced by the vegetation growth, right? Which is why it's evidenced by the coastal erosion line most often, or the debris line. So we know the shoreline then moves landward, moves inland with sea level rise. When there is a legal seawall, case law says that that fixes the shoreline. Legal seawalls get to stay as long as they don't get more than 49% damaged, which is a big question mark, right? So if you get theoretically more than half of your damage in a legal seawall, you don't necessarily have the right to repair it. And so legal seawalls even have this question of like, what do you do with that, right? Not legal seawalls, of course, don't fix the shoreline. And basically case law says the shoreline exists somewhere in back of it at an unknown location. In 2020, Act 205A was updated, and it was updated, I don't know, I struggle with this amendment. It was updated to say we should prohibit construction of private shoreline hardening structures. So it's kind of like saying we actually already did prohibit it, but in practice we weren't really following our rules. So now we really mean it, right? By the way, we actually meant what we said, and that's what this is supposed to say. But this is the part that I struggle with. So it says we need to minimize the construction of public shoreline hardening structures, including seawalls or abutments. But minimize doesn't mean it's not allowed, right? So now we have sort of a double standard for private property versus public property. And there are no real plans around public property that I can see. Oh, that's not true. Ho'opiliolani Highway in Maui is a different case. But we kind of have two standards, and public property is like, okay, well, we don't have to move it. We can harden it with the law. We started this kind of like general line of inquiry at ISR with, like, we really wanted to talk to people who deal with this every day and get a sense of what are they thinking, how are they making decisions, how are they prioritizing what happens and what should be important, right? And so we had an NSF Coastlines and People grant, and we picked 3 very distinct communities, all on the island of Oahu. So Sunset, Ka'ava, and Kahala. For those of you familiar with these areas, right? Their beaches are very different from one another. They're sort of socioeconomically diverse. They have different coastlines in terms of the type of sand, the level of hardening, things like that. But we chose it all on Oahu, well, for 2 reasons. The first sort of good academic reason is that they're all under the same exact governance structure, right? Same county rules, same state rules, nothing differs. But then the second reason was that it was during COVID and we couldn't travel. So this was also just like really practical. We decided to just do Oahu. Okay, so we asked people what they thought was, currently important and driving decision making. Oh, and we talked to 42 different folks whose jobs influence what happens on the coastline. So the Department of Transportation, the Board of Water Supply, Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands, right? So anybody whose job intersected with a decision that's going to shape our coastline, we interviewed here. As well as a lot of nonprofit groups, I should say. So what's currently important and what should be important. Let's see. Okay, so one of the things you'll note for Sunset, for example, is what's currently important is onshore recreations. This is surfing, right? Surfing is super important at Sunset Beach. Nearshore recreation, also kind of surfing, tourism, aesthetic beauty. And then the places where we see the most divergence is in real estate values, right? We're saying like, well, actually that probably shouldn't be as important as it is, right? There's this gap between what's currently important and what there should be. Tourism, same, there's a little bit of a gap. And here in ecological functions and habitats, we found that, it should be more important than it currently is. And this is something we heard a lot in our interviews, is like, we've stopped seeing beaches as ecological spaces, right? That we view them as really, really human-centered spaces, and we're not really thinking about their ecological functions anymore in that beach zone. In Ka'ava, let's see, similarly, ecological functions need to be more important. Here, the things that are important are its historical significance, its aesthetic beauty, maybe not needing to be as important. And the thing we need to make more important is valuing subsistence activities. In Kahala, real estate values are incredibly important, and maybe we need to not think about them so much. Ecological functions, we need to think about way more. So these are kind of the ways that people were explaining this to us. So if we go into these areas, just real quickly, right? Most of Sunset Beach is not hardened. This is an addition from Brad Romine's dissertation work that John Lynham then updated, and that's kind of how we have these layers of where the seawalls exist. And we really just see it sort of at the ends of, a Sunset Point and then towards Rocky Point. This, of course, is the picture I showed you earlier, and you can kind of see just the aerial of, this is a crisis zone of erosions happening right on these homes. Ka'ava is really different. It's almost entirely hardened, right? And the hardening is very public in nature. It's hardened because of the road and things like Swansea Park, right? And that was a very deliberate decision to make a park so you had public accessibility and a gathering space to the beach. The park actually wasn't meant to be a seawall, but it's become a seawall with erosion, right? So that park has basically got a seawall too. Same with the road. And Kahala, these are interesting seawalls. I did have a research assistant for this project pull up every single permit for every single wall in Kahala because I wanted to know their stories. And none of them are seawalls, right? They're privacy walls. You can imagine the vision, right? The vision was that you had this really nice house with this really beautiful beach, right? And then you had your wall that kept your lot flat and also kept people off of your lot, right? And so that's what they're all built as. But over time, they've become seawalls. So this question of what is their structural integrity to actually deal with this? You can see when you go and you look at the walls in this area that they're being fixed all the time, right? That people are sort of squirting different kinds of concrete things into the walls to keep them up. And here what we really have, well, also in Kava, is kind of like these low tide pocket beaches. You see people go in and run to the one lot that's not there, so you actually have a beach, right? And some privacy. Okay. So in that same research project, we just had it in 2 publications. We asked people specifically about the possibilities of retreat in these 3 areas. And this is really messy and I don't expect you to see all of it, other than to say that there was, broad agreement that, let's see, there's very, very broad agreement in general that retreat was really viable. But when you got into the specifics of neighborhoods, then people would be like, actually, maybe not, right? So if you ask the question in our interviews in a really broad way, it's like, well, of course we have to move things out of the way because our public trust doctrine says we support beaches, 205A says we support beaches, so that's what we're going to do. Oh, but no, in Ka'ava, that's really hard, right? And you're like, yeah, but it's really hard. But the reasons for not doing it in Ka'ava were mainly around to protect the road, right? And there was a lot of good conversations in these interviews about well, where else would you put that road? There's just tons of coastal squeeze there. And if the water infrastructure is under that road, right? In Kahala, it was a little bit different. Kahala was let's see. Sorry, I'm kind of losing track of this. But in Kahala, my recollection is that it was a little bit more well, maybe it's possible, but there's just so much real estate value there. And so maybe you want to do things in a softer approach and whatnot than you would otherwise. So I pulled out a couple of quotes that I like that sort of summarize these interviews. So for Sunset Beach, everyone agreed you have to retreat. And this wasn't necessarily ideological, right? Even folks, interviewees who were oh, you're never going to retreat Kaava or Kahala, were oh, you have to retreat Sunset Beach. And so this is a quote from somebody who was totally not for retreat in general. There is no engineering solution. You have a 20-foot high sand berms that are formed by our famous winter surf, some of the most energetic surf in the world. You can't do hard shore protection there. What are you going to do? Build a 30-foot seawall? It's just not feasible. You can't nourish the beach. It's too dynamic. There's too much sand movement. So right now, Sea Grant is working on a North Shore beach management plan, and this is the kind of pickle that they're going to have to work out with the community, right? For Ka'ava, I like this quote. So if we have to harden something to protect the shoreline, it's possible at least to shift a little bit to allow fishermen to recreate instead of being like, 2 feet away from the traffic lane. So this person was saying like, okay, you're probably going to harden the shoreline in Ka'ava because of the road and the water infrastructure, but can you at least design it well, right? At least make a big shoulder area so fishermen can still get there, right? And so we're still valuing the subsistence in that area. Kahala. Oh man, I hate when I go there. I feel sad. It feels like a place that is stripped of its sense of place to me. The water is murky, the reef is covered in invasive algae. There are all these weird mansions with abandoned lots and seawalls. So this was something we actually heard a lot. And I pulled it out because it pairs with this thought, which is there's so much opportunity for restoration there and helping revive that sense of place, right? And when you actually look at, like there's one lot off of Hunakai that whenever I go and jump in the water there, I always look because you can perfectly see like the sand layers and then the dirt layers that they brought in order to make a nice yard, right? And so when you, and these houses are built on sand, right? Way far back, still on sand, and you can see it in those layers. And you can imagine, right, with a lot of money, you can imagine restoration of that place. You can imagine taking off those dirt layers and shaking that sand loose and still having a really nice beach, which is kind of what we heard here. Another thing we explored in this project was who should be involved, right? Who owns sea level rise decision making? Like, how do we think about the governance of beaches? And the thing that came across loud and clear is our typical community planning strategies aren't cutting it, right? That when you're talking about histories of displacement, also of beaches being a global resource that many different people enjoy, and also people have really, really, really deep relationships with, but they might not live in that community and often don't, right? Then you need to make your involvement really wide, right? Decisions about beaches should not be made solely by communities of residents, right? Because that really negates all of the other people who use and value beaches across Hawaii. So how to do that exactly, we didn't get to, but that was the loud and clear message of those interviews. So this inquiry, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, we started looking at property values with this question of like, to what extent are markets responding to sea level rise signals? So like, to what extent is adaptation going to happen autonomously, right? Things are happening physically, people are going to see that in the market and then be able to change their behaviors signified by market prices. So this particular work we did in 2023, and it's in climatic change, and it's Oahu focused. We had a Zillow data set at this time. And what I thought was really cool was that you could measure it. Sea level rise is across Oahu negatively and statistically significantly impacting home values, right? Of course, that's like the aggregate number, right? There's a lot of unevenness and heterogeneity through communities, but across all of Oahu, you can definitely measure it, and it's getting more salient over time. So if you look back to the 1990s, it was not significant at all. It starts to become negative in the early 2000s, but not statistically significant. It becomes negative and statistically significant starting in 2007, in the sort of 2007-2013 time period, and then clearly negative and statistically significant, even more so in this 2014 to 2019 time period that we had data for. So it's getting more salient. People know more about sea level rise, they're paying attention, and more so. So one of the things that's happened policy-wise since we did this inquiry is that now we have the disclosure law, right? All real estate disclosures have to say whether you're in the sea level rise exposure area, which is the 3.2 feet overlay of all of those maps. So in a couple of years, we really want to do this again, right? Is it going to jump as a result of even taking away that sort of asymmetric information issue? We actually did do that analysis again once we got better real estate data. We were able to get our hands on real estate data from Black Knight, which is better statewide coverage. We had more data layers, and so we actually did do a very similar inquiry to the one we just said for the entire state. And it's been accepted in climatic change, but it's not yet publicly available. We're still like in the proof phase. And the takeaway from this is we also find that it's negative and statistically significant. The dimensions here are different because this is like a relative rate versus the other one I just showed was like a level value. And then one of the things we were able to do in this paper that I thought was really interesting was look at the effects of being, well, I gotta be careful with my words. Look at the effects of having a local address at the time of purchasing or not, right? So basically, like, how much does local knowledge change your kind of risk perceptions potentially, right? And we don't know it's fully risk, but it's some kind of preference. So we found, well, so sorry, the highlight there is that non-local buyers pay more, and it's statistically significant, right? And so we don't know whether they come here and live in those homes. Like, we don't have that information. All we know is we have their address, the point of sale, right? And so people who had non-local addresses paid more than people with local addresses. And so this led us to just be like, how prevalent is this, right? Particularly on our beaches. Because when you talk about retreat out in communities, like a lot of what you hear is like, I don't want a buyout program that just buys out those, you know, rich landowners on the beach. And then you hear the opposite too. It's like, well, you need something because there's that family that's been there for generations and this is their entire family wealth, right? And so with this data set, we've actually been able to start teasing out when houses are transacted and how much they're transacted for, and also the addresses of transactions. So this is just a little bit of descriptive statistics, but this is over time from 2000 to like 2022. The percentage of out-of-state buyers across the state, it's about 25%, relatively flat. Gels with our prior thinking. The percentage of out-of-state buyers when you just pick, I think this is a half mile from the coast. I can't quite remember what we did here, but I think it's a half mile from the coast. So when you just go coastal, it jumps up a lot to 50%. And then when you just take the first row of houses on the beach, it jumps up to 70%, right? So again, what we're finding is that there are, well, so the first thing I had when Conrad, who worked on this, showed this to me was like, okay, can we tell if this is a price effect or an income effect, right? We don't have the income of buyers, so we can't say that. But using home sale as a price, as an income proxy, one of the things we then did was say like, okay, at what point is the split even between out of state and in-state when you start going up Malka? And the short answer is real people who are buying expensive houses in Hawaii who have a resident, a local address, they buy Malka, right? They exist, they're just buying upland. And the people who buy expensive homes without a local address buy at the beach. So high takeaway. So what does that mean, right? Well, I think it tells us something about risk perception potentially, right? And the way that there may be asymmetric information still happening here, and not fully understanding the mechanisms of the coast. Okay, so one of the things, how am I doing on time? Okay. One of the things that after sitting on a North Shore working group meeting during COVID, or kind of series of meetings, this effort where North Shore community members and the Surf Rider Foundation were getting together to say, like, what are we going to do with our beaches across this area, right? Like, they're in crisis. So I sat in that working group really as a fly on the wall, sort of taking it all in. And what struck me was the thing people kept talking about was like, okay, we know we need to retreat because of all those reasons, but we don't understand exactly when and how, right? What should be the timing of this? Is this like a do it right now, or is this a do it in 25 years thing? So we decided to do a study all about timing of retreat. So we said, okay, this is what our shoreline laws are currently leading us to, right? Reactive retreat. And this would be, you have an event, you have a wave event that leads to erosion, house falls into the coast. Of course, this is like the second house on that coastline in the last few years, right? In that moment, there's like incredibly high risk to public safety, also environmental contamination entering the coastline, right? Houses are full of things like asbestos and lead, right? And once they enter the nearshore environment, we've interviewed people who do this kind of work, and they're like, oh yeah, no, there's no cleaning that up, right? You can get the big stuff, and that's like about it. So once it becomes small stuff in the nearshore, there is no cleaning that up. The other thing is there's a lot of like concrete and rebar, right? Swimming pools that are broken up in the coast. So there's just a lot of things that are incredibly dangerous. And a lot of this is happening around swell events. So you'll see pictures of like surfers going between the concrete and trying to get out, right? So it's like incredibly dangerous. We don't quantify that danger, but I just want to like really emphasize that it's there and it's a cost, right? So this is the reactive retreat. We say, what if we become slightly more proactive? Kind of like a just-in-time retreat idea, right? We're gonna let you stay up until your house is imminently threatened. And imminently threatened means 20 feet from the shoreline. And at that point, you will be compensated. You have to legally be compensated, right? Just compensation. You can't take private property without that. You will be compensated either through a voluntary or involuntary buyout mechanism. And at this point, we retreat the property. And then this is kind of like, well, what happens if you wanted to do like a huge outlay of like a new park, right? You could, in theory, say this whole area is going to be retreated in the long run, so let's just do it now, right? And how would we compare that cost to others? So we try to quantify all of this, and real quickly, so we quantify the private structure removal, the private property loss. All of these houses are on cesspools, right? So removing those cesspools. We do everything kind of around building and land values, which also includes property acquisition and removal. One of the things we often hear from the city and state is like, oh, well, I mean, the city actually, is like, oh, well, if we like lose all of these houses, that's our property tax base. So like, what's that gonna do? But we actually try to estimate this as a cost as well. And then public infrastructure relocation and removal. So small roads, little roads, 2 houses, we don't relocate, but the big highway we do, right? And so relocation includes the cost of condemnation of new private property to build a new road, right? Which is really typical in the transportation planning kind of domain. All right, so putting that all together, right? So we spatially match the features of the Sunset Beach, so Sunset Point to Rocky Point area within the Sclerexa. And we do that with timestamps between now and 2100 using the PAC-iOS modeling products. And once we timestamp that, then we say when the costs are triggered and put it all into a net present value so we can compare it apples to apples. Okay, so all at once retreat, 3 different scenarios, like if you went all the way up to the high wave line versus if you just did the coastal erosion line. But all at once retreat is very expensive, right? And it's entirely at public cost, which is what this blue color is. Because if you do something that proactively, it has to legally be so, right? Reactive retreat, interestingly, I thought was almost the same price as threshold-based retreat, except with this threshold-based retreat, you mitigate these really high risks to public safety and environmental contamination, right? So from a financial cost perspective, they're incredibly similar. They're mainly around who pays. In the reactive, the private property owner pays more, right? Because they are liable for the debris in the coastline. They're liable to do all of that cleanup. So this pushes more, being proactive pushes more of it onto the public, but not nearly as much. But by waiting, by doing this sort of just in time, you actually do save the public a lot of money. And we also compare this to how much beach you would get, right? So this is comparing when the houses leave relative to the coastline. And of course, you get the most beach at the all at once. But the threshold-based retreat we found to have the most beach for the least cost, right? which of course from a public finance mechanism is something we look at. The most beach could still pencil out from a cost benefit analysis perspective, but you'd really have to sell what are those benefits, right? You'd have to have a dune restoration plan. You'd have to have all of that, really understanding that there are wide benefits in order to for that expense to make sense. The county of Kauai saw that work and said, can you do this for our island? And so we recently finished this, and it's under review in climate risk management. So we applied this threshold-based retreat methodology to 40 beaches across the island of Kauai. We left out Napali Coast just because there's no physical access, right? And so we took a beach scale kind of view here just to think about like beaches as, you know, communities as both beach regions, but also how they connect to one another, right? Because so much of this is about road infrastructure. And basically it's about $3.1 billion for Kauai to use that threshold-based retreat approach from now to 2100 across its entire island. So actually that number seems pretty reasonable to me, right? Like to save all the beaches, $3.1 billion, like there's crazier things. A lot of that cost is in Kekaha because of the coastal road. It's a huge coastal road right on the beach there. And a lot of that cost is actually triggered now and it's all the roads. The roads are already within the 20-foot trigger. So about half of the cost is like already triggered. And afterwards it smooths out. So you can see that here. So the infrastructure costs are like today, wham, up here, and then only rise moderately. Interestingly, the residential costs are way lower, but this affects the most beaches. 28 out of 40 of Kauai's beaches have residential properties fronting them. So this is really sort of a story of like residential retreat and roads. We do find that hotels matter a lot in terms of the cost, but there's very few beaches affected. So we also looked at like specific examples and typologies of communities for them, which, let's see, like Haena, for example, has incredibly high residential property values. And so the total cost is kind of high, but it's very few properties in comparison to like Waipoli, right? Which is actually a lot of apartment buildings right on the coast. And our newest work, this is something we're working on currently under a NOAA Adaptation Sciences grant, is all focused on Waikiki. So we're looking at Waikiki under different sea level rise scenarios. So a very optimistic world of 2 feet by 2100, kind of an intermediate world of 4 feet by 2100, and then the entire bit of Waikiki is inundated under 6 feet, right? So we're looking at 3 different sea level rise scenarios. Sea level rise futures under 4 different adaptation pathways for Waikiki. And the adaptation pathways basically have 2 bookends where they're really extreme. One bookend is like, let's just rebuild it right? Waikiki was built on fill. It's you know, the combination of sea level rise and subsidence. This whole area is really a lot of trouble. Let's just like acquire it, demolish it, build it again. So, right, so real extreme. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but it gives us like a bookend, right? So that's one extreme. And then the other extreme is this whole area is going to be flooded. So let's acquire it, demolish it, and make it a wetland. Let's restore it to prior activities. And then we look at 2 pathways in between, right? Let's have triggers. We do things in order to keep roads in place. Let's have triggers, and then we figure out what to do with buildings. And specifically, we say, we're working with Oceana Francis within the civil engineering department, and she's walked us through what buildings can stay and what buildings must go, right? So buildings that are very tall have extremely deep, hardy foundations, and they can stay, right? They can adapt in place, they can get wet flood proofed, you can have exterior wrapping, you can do all sorts of things for tall buildings. Short buildings are in a lot of trouble, right? They just don't have that ability. So we make some decisions about like when short buildings get demolished. So I thought these were kind of fun. Renee Sutter put these like AI visuals together yesterday. This morning I was like looking at our work folder and I was like, ooh. And so yeah, she said I could use them. So yeah, this all at once retreat idea, right, would be like, we're gonna just turn this back into a wetland, let all of my canal flood in there. You know, you could imagine park pathways. I don't know if any of you have seen Judith Stilgenbauer's Living with Water work in Waikiki, but this is really visuals, very akin to that kind of idea. And then incremental retreats. This is our kind of incremental pathway B that leads with the same areas, eventually retreating, but not all at once, right? You keep things in place as long as possible. And then once it gets to be difficult, then you start retreating. And so it doesn't lead to the entire area being retreated, but kind of like different parts of it, right? I don't know, Renee threw in like swampland in this visual, which I thought was kind of fun. But yeah, anyways. So we would acquire all lands and buildings and then restore. And then pathway C is the incremental accommodate. This is the one that I think we're sort of most likely to be on as a pathway, right? And this is, you start getting your roads flooding, which they already are on some days, right? You start getting flooding roads and you do a la Miami Beach and you raise the road, right? This is you kind of see basically Renee, I think Gemini together the visual of the Miami Beach corner into Waikiki. So you raise the road and now this building, which is getting adapted in place, you know, has like a downside. And so you have to have a little like way to manage the water there and some stormwater management systems, etc. So this is our incremental accommodate rebuild. In those costs, a lot of the major cost is in building up like walkways, circulation areas into the tall buildings that get to stay, and wet floodproofing them. The all at once rebuild, I'm not sure I think the Royal is like the best example of this, but basically the all at once rebuild is like, you raise it, you get more fill, or we're actually estimating how much fill. You do a massive beach nourishment, which actually any of the adaptive place ones need a massive beach nourishment, and then rebuild the buildings, right? So you kind of keep it all there. So this is our current work, and we do have some preliminary results, but they're too early and not vetted to share. But this is the kind of thing we're heading towards in terms of thinking about what do we do in urban centers, right? What do we, and this is a very different legal beach case, right? Because Waikiki Beach is an Army Corps made beach. It also has different legal protections from when it was developed, right? So there's legal agreements with the hoteliers there. So it really can be sort of a different kind of intervention from a legal standpoint. So again, these are our scenarios and what we're working out. It will have it in kind of cost numbers between now and 2100 very shortly. So key takeaways, the reactive approach to sea level rise adaptation is our current regulatory status quo. This is going to lead to a lot of nearshore pollution, limit lateral access along the coast, and be a danger to public safety. The real estate markets are responding to sea level rise risk. Oh, I didn't actually cover this part. But when you project that real estate discount out in time, it's just not that much. It's not going to create the autonomous adaptation that I think beach managers would like to see in terms of sea level rise response, right? So it's not going to be enough, but it is happening, right? There's a large gap in what coastal managers think should be prioritized in decision making. Right, cultural and ecological values versus what is being prioritized, and a lot of that is the real estate values and tourism values. And so, you know, that leads to a large gap in what the law says versus what's enforced, right? So right now we're sort of thinking about threshold-based retreat as like a nice Goldilocks thing. It's not that you would never do reactive retreat or never do all at once retreat, but we're finding in the examples so far that it really is kind of the lowest retreat cost while still preserving the beach and minimizing public safety risk and environmental contamination risks. Of course, there needs to be more work to define these triggers, right? We use this 20-foot trigger. In that Kauai work, we also looked at much closer triggers. We looked at things like 10 feet right? And that would be like just in time retreat, right? But there could be other triggers too, right? You could imagine triggers actually from groundwater inundation, like we are for the Waikiki project, which is triggering adaptation of the roads, right? So what are these things that then create action so that all of us aren't like, I forgot to check the tide last night and I went to a party in Waikiki and I don't have a car, right? That's what we don't want, right? And then adaptive place, should definitely happen in places, right? There are areas in which we have, a lot of urban infrastructure. We're not talking about beach ecosystems. But when we do that, we really need to think about the design elements. How do we keep some of those uses and values in place? Like the Ka'ava example, right? Like if we do decide to do that, still make it a place you could use. But so kind of just to make sure we're choosing all of these things, but in particular, this sort of like lock-in development idea, really eyes wide open. Thank you.